Hello, everyone. We are the Interoperability Workgroup. We're going to start with the antitrust policy first. And actually, if you want to grab the clicker there. Thank you. RESO strives to increase competition in the marketplace, will not be a forum for anti-competitive conduct. The RESO antitrust policy governs the activities of RESO and its members, including this meeting. A link to the policy was emailed to you with the meeting agenda. Please consult RESO's counsel if you have any questions about that policy. I don't see RESO's counsel in the room, so go find him. But yeah, if you've got questions, you know where to go. So we do want to get started, but we're going to get started with a little crowd participation. So Catherine, tell us what we want to do.
Okay, this is exciting. This was a suggestion from John Bro, if he's in the room. And we've heard about having a mixer, basically having a mixer. And we've heard from a lot of the groups today about communication. You know, who are we? So what we want to do is just take 5 minutes. This is going to be really quick. You're just going to find somebody beside you, even if you already know who they are. Okay, you're going to say your name. You're going to say who you work with. You're going to say one weird, crazy, interesting thing about yourself. And then you're going to think about the one real estate data problem that if it could get solved, your whole life would be better. Okay, go.
5 minutes.
And then remember what it is, because we're going to ask you.
Yes, we are going to ask for volunteers afterwards.
Yeah.
So remember what they told you.
Okay. Oh, they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
All right, so
Okay, it's 3:17.
25 or 24? 24? If it starts getting quiet at 25, we'll cut it. But if they're still going, give them the 24.
Perfect.
Okay. Oh, I'm going to sit down for a minute.
I'm Catharine MacIntosh.
Hi, Chris Haran.
I'm
Nice to
an
meet you.
assistant. I'm an artist. That's my wild, crazy thing. I love making art. I don't know if you know that. I
I
sculpt.
didn't know that, no.
Yeah. And the one thing that we could solve is being invited into every real estate space globally and easily transact seamlessly. So we could just provide amazing products.
I did not do my homework on this. All right, so Chris Haran, MRED, wild and crazy fact.
It's not easy.
No, it's really not. Well, I think the data problem, if I could solve today, would be, to me, it would be the interoperability for collecting data. So having our vendors share data together so that people could pick the choice of product they want, whether it's showings, whether it's transaction management. Like, if every vendor agreed to just say, hey, we're going to share this basic stuff, that would be mine. I don't know. During COVID, I learned how to make craft cocktails and bake, and somehow lost a ton of weight.
Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm. So that's my crazy fact.
Wow. 26.
All right.
Look at they're talking. It's awesome.
Mark and Damien, you guys know each other. Split up a little bit. All right, let's give 1 more minute. Remember, you got to remember the data problem, and if you want to share the crazy fact, that's fine, but that can be cone of silence with the two of you as well. All right, 30 seconds. Let's start wrapping it up.
I'll start by saying I talked to you.
Yes.
Okay, everyone, it sounds like this was a success because we're still here talking in the room. I love it. I love it. So just to break the ice, surprisingly, I talked to Chris and introduced myself to him. Okay, and this is what I heard from him. He's with MRED, so he's in an MLS, right? So I could relate to it being different from what I am. His crazy fun fact is that during COVID, he learned to bake and make interesting cocktails, but also lost weight. Right? Interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Oh, and the data problem that he would like to solve is he wishes that all the vendors he worked with could put down what they do, what they're great at, how they share data and kind of have like a one-stop shop platform.
Yeah, let agents have choice. Exactly.
Choice, yeah, for the agents. Right. So their MLS members have choice.
All right. So that's a good example. Yeah, let's see what they've got, right?
Yeah, let's see what you've got. So who wants to go?
Awesome. Step up to the mic. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, stand at the mic. That'd be great.
Okay, one problem to solve is compliance. If we could have standard compliance all across the board, that would be great.
Amazing. Okay, anybody else? We're going to pick somebody if you don't want to go.
Yeah, we need at least a few people to share these data problems. And you can share the crazy fact if you want to. Those are always fun too, especially late in the day.
Excellent. Great.
All right, I'll share our two data problems. One was replication. Web API has a little ways to go with supporting replication in a really elegant way. And the other one was how many custom fields we still have out there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, before we carry on, is there anybody else who wants to share what they learned from their neighbor? Or their own data problem they want solved?
Yeah, if you're looking at your neighbor right now and mad that they're not going up and talking for you, feel free.
But we can come back to this too.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. It's good that you all got to know each other. That's a good example of what interoperability does in a lot of cases during our workgroup meetings, just like we do in Pain Points and like a lot of the other workgroups do. As mentioned, I'm Chris Haran. Work for MRED. Got Catharine, CEO and founder of Listed. And we've been working together on interoperability for the last several years now. And interoperability was founded back in 2019, and we started with a pretty narrow use case around transaction management. But we've definitely branched out since then. And what I wanted to do is we've got 2 slides of a mission statement. And yes, you can definitely have death by mission. But we wanted to point out a couple of things on here in this. Specifically, this group's scope extends beyond the traditional MLS server. So obviously, and that was actually just said by Greg and the R&D group here, is we do have a lot of focus and concentration on the MLS at RESO because it is kind of the core and center of a lot of the data that's generated and pushed out. But what interoperability has really been focusing on a lot is how about those vendors that just talk directly to each other? Yes, they may be using MLS data and using property, listing, brokerage information, but they may be working more directly with each other. So how do we get those companies to interoperate? How do we get that information to pass from system to system, even if the MLS isn't the stop in between? So that's what a lot of interoperability has done. And like I mentioned, we started really with transaction management. But then the other half of that mission statement is we are definitely still using data dictionary models. We try not to create new unless it doesn't exist. We do always look to what is out there already, whether it's in the data dictionary, whether it's in transport, and what can we make use of that's already out there. You can see that these might exist downstream from the MLS. So going back to, it doesn't have to be about the MLS. But the other thing we've talked about a lot in the last 2 years in the interoperability workgroup is the common format for RESO, which that's basically being able to use JSON payloads. It's RCP 025 for those of you who like to throw out the numbers from transport. But the idea that you don't have to use the web API if you're not an MLS. So if you still want to use RESO standards and be able to pass those back and forth, and you're not an MLS, but you're another vendor in the space, using the common format to be able to still pass that information and use that, which we've seen plenty of examples both today and yesterday that's great of people who are doing this already. So this is the mission in a lot of words. So in looking for inspiration, how do we break that down, right? Like, we're always about cutting it down and getting to what's really important. And interoperability is really about making sure that data can go from one system to another easily. So if you're an agent, if you're a brokerage, some type of user, your data shouldn't be locked up. So how can interoperability support that mission of the end-to-end system in real estate? By letting that data go from one system to another. It is about promoting coopetition, a favorite word that everyone likes to use at RESO a lot, between those vendors, between MLSs, between everyone in the space. And it really is about getting a lot more value for our brokerages, for our agents, for all of our shared customers, by making sure that they can not have to spend a lot of time doing that data entry. All right, so what are we actually working on these days? We've got quite a bit. Like I mentioned, we did have transaction management to transaction management. For those of you who were here for the R&D work group a few minutes ago, we would love to come back to that at some point. We did a great first pass. That's part of the data dictionary now. And what we want to do next is see how can we get people using that, which is going to be a common theme for what we've been doing in interoperability for the last several months, is how do we take things that exist already and get more adoption? How do we get more uses? How do we maybe break it down and think of imaginative ways to use things outside of what their original use case might have been? We've also started looking at other vendor situations that we could work with. When we finished transaction management, a really simple one that was very similar was offer management. And we've got great news there in that we've got 3 submissions already, 2 from MLSs and 1 from a vendor. And then actually in the last month, we got a second one from another vendor. So for those of you who do come to work group meetings, which we'll promote those at the end, what we'll be doing is going back to offer management and hopefully proposing some new specs for offer management to Data Dictionary in the coming months. Because we do think we've got enough now to make that something that could be a potential part of the new version of the Data Dictionary. So offer management, transaction management. But then we've also been working a lot on the industry map, and that's gone through a lot of variations. So you want to talk a little bit about that, Catherine?
Yeah, absolutely. So the industry map pretty much started where Chris was just talking about innovations that could come from offer management or transaction management. The industry map is a way to look at who and what is sitting beside each other so that you can kind of have that conversation like you had with each other. I'm sure when you spoke with each other, you learned a pain point that maybe wasn't your pain point, but then your perspective was different than the other person's. So the industry map is a way to basically increase understanding and promote innovation. And just as an example that came up from the first day of the conference, which I thought was amazing, was a situation that was very serious. So the industry map for innovation, the other opportunity is risk mitigation. So this, on Tuesday morning, when we had Jay Pepper Martins from the San Francisco SFAR, Association of Realtors, and Zenlist, and their vendor Raptoni for SFAR, when Jay Pepper Martins was sitting up here and he basically said, I all of a sudden, when the data went down, had to take stock and get a list of all the vendors we work with and what's critical. And then he had to understand, like, what are brokers on the ground doing right now and what is the consumer seeing? So there were all these different layers or views where there maybe wasn't a conversation that if we had something like the industry map, right, you're not taking that tally in an emergency situation. You're taking that tally ahead of time with foresight and understanding so that you can come to R&D or our group in interoperability and make some suggestions that then make how we work more seamless.
And what's really interesting is as we started working on the industry map, which as we mentioned, it's had a couple different iterations on how we've looked at it, how we could use it. We were really doing it from an interoperability perspective because we wanted to see what companies connected and what they were passing back and forth. So whether it was a transaction, whether it was an agent, like how did those companies come together? And then where were the problems that we could solve from an interoperability perspective? And what ended up happening as a part of that conversation is we started getting some really interesting business cases being sent to us. And we started talking about what is interoperability's role within RESO in a lot of ways. So, you know, it's obviously how does interoperability fit within the industry? It's about making sure that data passes from one system to another, but then it's how does interoperability fit within RESO? And you saw an example of that with the R&D group. You know, we had one business case come to us where we were looking at the certification maps to use those for the industry map potentially, because obviously there's a lot of great data there, so how can we visualize that, who's connected to who, and that's some of the maps that Josh has been working on that are coming out soon. But as a result of that, we were looking at things like that IDX payload filter and say, well, why couldn't we do more with that? You know, if you have showing companies, if you have appraisal companies, rental companies, commercial companies, offer management, why couldn't we say really easily what fields are available in all the different resources that could be your payload specific to that type of use case? So that was one that we ended up writing up and sending to R&D. So that's how we interact a lot with R&D, and they'll send use cases back down to us. We've also spent a lot of time really studying transport, because transport does amazing work with some of the specs they put together. And what we've done is said, okay, these are great. We're not seeing as much usage as we'd like with all of them. So can we think of different ways to use these? And we'll get into examples there. We also then do a lot of work, obviously, with Data Dictionary, with transaction management. We're going to have something with offer management where we take a look at the existing resources. What can we add to existing resources? As an example, transaction management, we added a lot of new fields to the context resource to make that more amenable to people who use transaction management and have a lot of different roles outside of the traditional agent and some of the things we had in context. And then finally, with all of the certification statistics and analysis that's being done, we think that that's going to create a lot of opportunities for us in the Interoperability Workgroup to build out more of these resources, build out more of these business cases. So that's an example of 4 different work groups within RESO that we tend to kind of float around and bounce ideas off of and help support in a lot of ways.
And when you bring us a business case, we can often connect it to perhaps an RCP that might suit you that is already in existence. So we're not duplicating efforts, and we're able to take and increase what already exists to bring another implementation, perhaps.
Yeah, and for those of you who have never attended one of our work group meetings, it is an interesting mix of technical and business.
Yeah.
It's not going to be super technical like transport, but Josh is always in our meetings, and he's going to add what transport's talking about, so we get a nice flavor to it. But then we are talking a lot about, well, how does this apply, right? Like, how do we make this work, and how can we think outside the box to add new ideas to it? And as I mentioned, we'll get into some examples of that. But first, Catherine, you want to talk a little bit about what is paradise for real estate?
Yeah, Chris and I were thinking that, we're here in sunny San Diego, and it's kind of like paradise, right? And we started with the mixer asking, what problem would you want to solve? So when you were asking what problem you'd like to have solved, what is paradise for you? If that problem was solved, or many problems were solved, what does paradise look like? So we just wanted to bring up a vision for that. So imagine if all of a sudden, when you asked anybody on the street what they thought of realtors, it would be a renowned profession, right? They're amazing people. And all of a sudden, there's no data licensing requirements. There's just open flow of data through your agent. You want to sell your house or you want to buy something, you have this seamless ability to get accurate, reliable data. And from your realtor, who's part of an association and then who's part of a brokerage, there's a seamless flow of data between participants in the MLS, between brokerages, between realtors. So if there were no hindrances to data portability, right? If you all of a sudden had an MLS and all of a sudden you needed to change a provider, what if you could just seamlessly do that? What if data visibility and display rules were clear and obvious? We knew all the requirements and we could easily see them. What if there was consistency and accuracy and standardization? The fact that we're all at RESO is great because that's the standard that we're aiming for. So what is paradise to you? And on the next slide, we're taking these kind of 5 faves that we want to talk about. So we like to link them to RCPs. So the first one is the Pulse, RCP 27. Then we're going to talk about Add Edit, RCP 010. Chris is going to touch on the Transaction Management RESO Common Format, RCP 025. And then the Universal Property Identifier. And then we're going to just talk about transport specs and how they connect with interoperability. And then this idea of what is the flame under the MLS is, how does change happen in the MLS? If paradise is that change is seamless and easy and everything's running smoothly, the reality is that, maybe there's one meeting a month and processes are opaque. So how can change happen? And who's going to instigate that?
And I think a good example of that is for those of you who sat in on the broker advisory work group to start the afternoon, we heard Jeff and Nina on their panel talk about agent needs, and the agent they were interviewing brought up a lot of specs without saying them by name for RESO. So it's how do we, and that's really what interoperability has been focusing on the last couple of months. And when we talk about like the flame underneath the MLS is how do we help build those business cases to promote that to use these things. It's not about creating new, like these all exist. They're great, they've been vetted by all the technical people. It's then how do we take that to the business side and actually get them using it? And how can we help them imagine different ways to use that? So that's what we want to do is let's talk a little bit about the imagining as we've been talking about these with our work group for the last couple months.
Okay, this is great. So for showings and the Pulse, the idea here was that you pull data and it's a heavy load, and what if you could just on the fly, when it mattered, get a notification that something happened? Right? So with a showing, 5 minutes could be a long time if all of a sudden you're waiting for a response. Same with offers. If you're an agent and you're dealing with offers and you wanted to let people know how many had been registered or what's going on, the pulse in RCP 27 and 28 is basically a way to, instead of having to pull for data and see what's changed, get a notification instantly so that data can be seamless and up to date and you can act quickly.
Well, the other thing that's really interesting with this example in particular is one of the things that Catherine and I both do is we pay attention to the other work groups a lot and what they're talking about. And even today on stage, during the rental section, we heard a very good discussion about basically what's going on with 27 and 28, using webhooks, using Pulse, and we hadn't even talked to those guys. We're going to now and say, hey, were you using these specs? Is this something we can add to it? Is this something that is a good example, a good implementation? But it's another demonstration of what we try and do is we are trying to listen and pay attention to what's going on in all the work groups and all these different possible implementations, and how do we tie it back to what already exists and prove out that this works and show others, here's a path you can take.
Yeah, because it'd be very interesting if they even knew about this spec when they did that. And the thing is, when there's a spec, then you can actually fix it for everyone.
So this is an example of the high quality work that a RESO work group does, which is when we were talking about showings as an example. We just put up a really, really basic, like, how does a showing work? Like, what are the different pieces that go back and forth? And in this particular case, what we wanted to do is say, okay, what are all the different RCPs that would go into this, right? And what are the different resources that would be a part of this? Because this particular discussion, what we had 2 months ago, was focused on the idea of how do we help educate about RESO? You know, is there a RESO blueprint for especially new companies coming in or even existing companies on, you know, I want to do something, how can I do that? And what we decided was we're going to take showings and say, okay, well, here's the showing life cycle, and here's all the different pieces of RESO that fit into that. Here's the data that might be part of that payload filter if we were to tag that for showings. And the idea that we want to continue to do, because we always like to have some technical, some business in each meeting, is from the business proportion is continued coming up with these stories and saying, okay, if we did showings, let's say I want to do a CRM, like what does the CRM use? And the idea there, again, is to say for people who don't maybe understand everything that RESO has to offer, how do we get you moving really quickly and understand everything that's there and be able to pull all of that into whatever you're putting together. So this was a good example with that RESO's staff will definitely marketize for us and make look nicer. So this is not something you'll ever see on the RESO website, but it'll be something that RESO staff gets so that they make look professional and able to go on the RESO website at some point, showing you how you could walk through that journey. And then this is,
yes.
Yeah. So this was another example. We were talking about RCP 010, which is the ad edit. And I think many people look at that and they think, well, so that means we have to make it so you can write to the MLS. And that's just a really big project. It's a whole lot of work to do. You know, we'll put it on the roadmap, but it's going to be one of those things that keeps getting bumped down, down, down. And so what we said is, like, it doesn't have to be that big of a task. What else could you do with that? How could you break that down and find other use cases? And one of the interesting ones we talked about was roster data, which really became a big thing, especially after recent incidents with cybersecurity in our industry. So how could you use this to maybe edit from an AMS into the MLS updated roster data, pull in license information, things like that? Or to push it back out if something changed in the MLS, be able to push that to the AMS. But really just focusing on that one resource, just the member resource, just the office resource. But you could still use what 010 was meant for, but just for a little piece. Another example we talked about outside of roster data was media. And this is something that Transport's still working on, but I know that in our marketplace, there's been a lot of requests for photographers to be able to go into the MLS and be able to upload photos directly and move those photos around and caption them and title them, because that's part of the marketing services they want to provide. And obviously, we don't want to be giving away user IDs, and some of us don't have affiliate types that we would give those photographers. So is there a way that we can create a technical implementation where they could, from their system, do all this work and push it to us? Another good example of how you could use 010 and something that MRED wants to do as a proof of concept sometime in the near future, because that's definitely something that's for us. So, but Catherine, anything
actually,
else?
that just also came up in the last broker advisory work group Nina brought up, which was, you know, if you're updating data, it could be from any source. You could have, you know, your photo, your bio, seamlessly even extend your brand, make sure that your brand, if it's able to then get syndicated to a number of sites, is consistent and you know how it's showing across platforms.
Yep. This next one we've already talked about quite a bit, so we won't spend as much time on it, but the idea with transaction management, where it all started for us, was this is not something that has to be done off the RESO web API, right? Because an MLS is not involved in this conversation. This conversation is between one transaction management company and another transaction management company. So if they use that common format schema, it's just JSON payloads that they can send back and forth using RESO fields. Makes it very easy to stick to the RESO standardization, but doesn't make them conform to something like web API if they don't want to use that. So that's why I wanted to mention that one, because that continues to be helpful as RESO expands outside the MLS space internationally. This is going to make it a lot more flexible for us to continue to have interoperability.
And when we first had that discussion, Chris, with transaction management, just imagine the utility and having an offer, and you each use different transaction management platforms, but you can immediately see when the other party has signed something and then you get it back and it's validated. So it's high efficiency between vendors. Okay, this is the universal property identifier, and we say it's universal, not unique. In fact, universal implies uniqueness, because if 3 different people have this pull the UPI on a property, it should always be the same. That is the point. So just to bring up, again, earlier, we had a broker on stage, Zane, who basically brought up his need for the UPI and the ULI, the unique licensee identifier, without even realizing it. And his first example is the example I was going to bring up first, which is eradicating erroneously duplicated properties. So, it's amazing that in an MLS, if you have a property that comes in 1030 King Street, W, and then 1030 King Street, it's the same property, but it can come into the system as it's 2 different properties, just because the address is different. And so it appears different, but it is not. And that very example happened and was brought up this morning. And so the second thing is that when you have a property or a listing coming in from multiple MLSs, then in some spaces you have duplicate and triplicate listings. And how do we in 2023 describe to a consumer why there's 3 or 2 instances of the same property? So with the third instance, you could take all those instances, attach them through a universal property identifier, and then they're all aggregated. And then how you show that there are 3 available listings on one property is yet to be determined, but at least you could group them all together. And in the first example of the address being slightly different and then it erroneously being as if it's 2 different properties, where that really has an impact is on the property history, because when you go to a property and you want to see its history, if one of those is missing, then you think it's even worse because you think you have accurate data and then you don't, right? So if you're an agent and you're dealing with clients, that could be really frustrating. So these are solvable problems.
And UPI and ULI pop up a lot in our interoperability conversations, because ultimately interoperability is sharing data, and data shares have redundancies and duplication. And so that's why it's so important and why we continually have this as part of any spec that we talk about.
Oh, and just one of the things before we go back to that, this UPI slide, that's really important is we've been working on this for a really long time. Mark Bissett, who runs is up next. Our group is up next, and you'll hear from them. We've been working on this for a very long time, and at the last conference, it came up that people weren't seeing it in their MLS data. Like, it's actually not showing up. So in Canada, we are in Toronto, and we are actually trying to get an implementation going with a large MLS system there. It's actually a system that comprises of 20 MLSs. The vendor is awesome, and they've said that they're willing to work, and the system itself just basically can turn it on in a filter. And what we need is the tax assessor to be able to provide this to all of us for this to work. So one of the things that came up was that perhaps one of the elements that would be in the data pass was proprietary, right? So this could just stop the whole thing from working. And so one of the items that came up in the work group was that if we were able to hash the number, then we could get over that, and then it would allow us to put this implementation together. So this is just a way that we want to be able to move forward with implementations and overcome some of the barriers that prevent this data portability and accessibility.
And a lot of it is us reaching out to all of you in this room and the people back at your markets and helping to push these ideas forward. So Catherine, in our last 10 seconds, we got to get through the last slides here, but you want to talk a little bit about this one, and then,
Well, we just don't want to pave paradise. Whatever your vision of paradise was, we don't need to put up a parking lot. We're all here at RESO So I think we need to get behind the curtain, the way we started with the mixer, have that conversation with people, come to our work group, and bring up your pain points. So one last thing that's really important is, our greatest technology is the MLS. The MLS needs to remain the source of truth. In order to do that, if it actually opens up portability and access to data by working with vendors and understanding all the different products you can provide to members, then you're actually really strengthening the wheel of the MLS by having many spokes and a very strong wheel with a central hub. And it's by working together through that central wheel that we achieve this kind of motion. So interoperability requires cooperation, and we're going to use the industry map and other tools to map the gaps. And sometimes you just need to let your MLS know what you need, or the MLS needs to spur the vendor and ask for it in the case of the UPI to make sure it exists.
Absolutely.
This is great. Okay, just like you want to be fit, right? But are you going to go to exercise class unless you have a little bit of help? So think of interoperability as coming to the fun exercise class where we actually can translate what's going on in transport. So when you have an idea and you bring it to us, then at some point we want to actually be able to take transport, which can make the ideas become a reality. So it's bridging that connection. You don't have to be technical. You just need to bring the pain point, and then we can take that and create a spec and put it to the other work groups, R&D down to transport, and make it happen.
So if any of that interests you, we're the second Tuesday of each month. Our next meeting is actually December 12th. We're going to take November off, but 12 Pacific, 3 Eastern. 2 Central. Love to have you there. We've got a really good core group, and we've continually added as the months have gone on. But you see what we're working on. We'd love to see more, and especially if you're in the offer management space, transaction management space, any of those vendors that work outside of the MLS that would like to promote that co-opetition, we'd love to have you and talk through that. So thank you, and any comments, ideas, pain points, send there. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.